agency fosters an ambient atmosphere for negotiation between these two countries, settling on an agreement to exchange natural resources in a mutually beneficial manner. Since our organization regulates natural resource allocation on a regional level between countries and uses these resources as currency, it not only eliminates economic exploitation, but also furthers benevolent international relations between countries. Moreover, the establishment of this agency is a step forward to a more level playing field in global economics. Earlier this year, we witnessed and are still witnessing how the world's two biggest trading nations announced a dueling tariff. The United States and China are now amidst a trade war, with tariffs on the opposing nations' goods rising up to 25% higher than normal, according to the official government newspaper in China, China Daily, as well as BBC and CNN. This is extremely disruptive to global trade due to the economic power that the United States and China hold. Since the United States declared tariffs citing China's violation of fair trade policies, this would not have happened if our organization were in place. Moreover, early in 2017, Japan challenged the legality of South Korea's sovereignty over the Langkurt rocks in the South China Sea. The subsequent struggle for land is actually a reflection of competition for scarce natural resources, as these rocks were found to be ample in fish and are expected to have significant amounts of subsea oil, gas, and mineral reserves. As our organization promotes fair trade through distributing resources according to need, it effectively eliminates chances for economic malpractice. Once our organization is implemented, no longer would politically influential countries be able to manipulate and exploit less economically developed countries. This is a much more effective, peaceful, and long-term solution to economic disputes, which are essentially based on unequal resource distribution. Our organization provides an alternative to the competitive Western-dominated economy, an alternative that would end economic disputes by distributing the world's natural resources fairly, as it is everyone's human rights to access essential resources. Our organization would also foster better international relations, as economic security is no longer threatened. Thus, we, the Affirmative team, firmly believe that our organization, as an international trade maker between countries of need, according to the need of resources and the abundance of resources, is a mutually beneficial organization for the distribution of natural resources worldwide. As we summarize our points, this is seen how our organization actually does not violate national sovereignty, as this is on a completely voluntary and needed basis with the consent of countries involved. As we have seen before in various conflicts, such as the United States and Chinese trade war, as well as the conflicts over the Langkurt rocks, resource scarcity is now becoming one of the greatest security risks in the 21st century. To prevent these countries' competition from degenerating into conflict, we should have an organization to control and allocate, as well as equally distribute the world's scarce natural resources. My partner Dawan will demonstrate the deep historical need of our agency in her speech, whose existence could have, in which our organization's existence could have prevented numerous resource conflicts, such as the Congolese Wars, and she will also explain how the resource curse will be lifted by our organization as well, thus successfully fostering a better society as a whole, as well as improve our global economics today. Thank you.
7 minutes and 36 seconds were used.
Thank you for your speech. Firstly, do you agree that the UNEP's ECP had been a fail in Sudan and Darfur, where people are now being slaughtered because of their need for water?
This does not change the fact that the Expert Advisory Group on Environment, Conflict, and Peacebuilding affirmed that resource scarcity is one of the greatest security risks of our century.
Yes, but if they claim to be solving these problems, then what do you have to say about people being killed because they want access to a human need?
We did not mention any sort of action taken by UNEP in our speech, thus we believe this is irrelevant.
All right. Do you realize that national interest tends to corrupt the minds of leaders and that these aren't always positive?
We believe that each nation has their own people's benefits in mind, and thus we should respect that, as we should respect national sovereignty, which our organization fully does while leveling the economic playing field.
Yet what if these perspectives and needs are in no way beneficial to the environmental community, the international community?
Then this is why our organization should be put into place, as we take in mind the equitable distribution of resources.
Yet don't we want
across
to hear the
nations.
opinions of every country?
We do, and our organization does exactly that.
Alright. What if Australia refuses to benefit Ethiopia, and what if they decide to withdraw from the agreement midway? Then doesn't this create more damage than benefit?
We have stated that our organization is legally binding, and this is an exchange, so they cannot back off without giving resources. My partner will also elaborate how Australia did indeed give Ethiopia their firewood, and this fostered better international relations, which our organization will do as well.
Do you think that the ideals of leading politicians and delegates need to be altered to fit the international community?
We do not believe that our organization would have this issue.
Yeah, but what if their perspectives, like I said before, don't benefit the international community and their move towards scarce resource management?
Time.
Good morning, honorable judges, esteemed guests, and fellow debaters. My name is Malak, and I represent the International School of Azerbaijan, and I'll be presenting the negatives first argument as well as rebutting some of the affirmatives points. So, for all of the points made by the affirmative, they claim that they would be creating a new idealistic international organization that would not impose on national sovereignty of individual states, would be legally binding, and be completely voluntary. However, while providing examples of where this hypothetical international organization could be implemented, they failed to actually realize that they did not necessarily provide any examples of how it would work, why it would be possible for it to work, or any actual facts or statistics on how exactly it could be formed and how they could enforce the fact that how they would enforce their newly created policies or any similar ideas. So they stated that at the very beginning of the first affirmative speaker's speech, she stated that there would be no national affiliation of this international organization. It would simply be a completely neutral party, a third party with no bias on any conflicts that could be occurring over scarce natural resources. However, we cannot trust that this would be true. Human nature does not necessarily allow for unbiased thought, as has been proven over history, over countless and countless examples throughout time. We cannot simply look at a situation and with no bias come to a conclusion. That has been proven to have never worked, especially with a third party looking at a nationwide conflict over something as serious as natural resources. How could this third party remain completely unbiased? How could we ensure that there is no political agenda or no national agenda if it is made up of separate states? If it has no national affiliation but it is made up of separate countries, how could this be ensured? Every country has their own well-being in mind. Every country's leaders, every country's representatives have their own agendas in mind. How would we ensure, and why would we ensure that this international organization would be effective, and how would we ensure its spread of resources would be equitable? Furthermore, who would decide that this is equitable? Because if we have, for instance, as they mentioned, a conflict between Australia and Ethiopia over wood, how would they decide who gets the larger share, who gets the smaller share? We can't necessarily decide that it would be exactly half. Furthermore, they gave examples of competition over resources, but what exactly would it do? Who is to say that countries such as China or Congo would allow for a new organization to get involved in their economic policies? Countries with such competitive economics, such as China, who would say that they would allow a random third party to get involved in their economic policies when they already have several international organizations breathing down their necks over their own economic trade? Furthermore, if existing international organizations such as the United Nations cannot get involved in issues such as the South Chinese Sea due to their own corruption, as my partner will explain later, how can we ensure that a newly formed third party with no very specific agenda, as they simply stated that it would be creating policies and being a perfect idealistic international organization, why would the opposition believe that a newly founded agency would be allowed into these areas, would be allowed to solve these issues when even trusted international organizations, or supposedly trusted international organizations, that several countries such as China are signatories of, are members of, cannot get into these areas and cannot solve these issues? Thus, we believe that their argument is invalid as it deals entirely in hypotheticals and does not necessarily provide any actual facts or statistics for how it would work. Now, to move into our first point, we argue that oftentimes in regions of conflict, international organizations fail to successfully and efficiently control scarce natural resources. Due to inaccessibility and dangerous conditions, these international organizations often serve no purpose in conflict zones and cannot necessarily achieve their supposed goals of delegating natural resources to civilians in need. One major example of this is the often criticized United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS for short. While the mission was created for the noble purpose of protecting civilians and providing them with aid, poor mismanagement and a lack of resources and support rapidly led to a generally misused and essentially helpless mission, despite the billions of dollars the United Nations and its own members invest into this mission every single year. It has yet to reap any actual benefits. Firstly, the United Nations mission in South Sudan cannot fly helicopters without permission from both sides of the conflict of the civil war. Thus, their response is delayed and often ineffective. Furthermore, in order to ensure safe passage on land, they need the permission of the Sudan's People's Liberation Army, with one commander of the mission even admitting that without their authorization, his peacekeepers do not even leave the base to retrieve water for civilians. Peacekeepers in general are not assured safety or medical response. UNMISS's bases are so poorly stocked with medical supplies and transportation of injured peacekeepers is never ensured, again due to the required permission. And as such, morale is understandably low, and we can infer that this leads to poor work and failure to respond to risks effectively. This was illustrated very recently with an incident in which a woman was abducted in front of a group of UN peacekeepers in South Sudan, and they failed to respond to even this. Furthermore, the Security Council fails to aid the mission effectively by not taking necessary action to protect civilians or punish the South Sudanese government. Although they threatened the government with sanctions if they did not stop propagating the conflict, they have yet to actually place embargoes. When they did actually pass a resolution and the UN tried to import military, the Security Council did nothing to punish this uncalled for intervention, furthering the ineptitude of the UN mission in South Sudan. To explain just how desperate the situation has become, at least 98 aid workers have been killed in the country since civil war broke out in 2013, with both rebels serving the deposed vice president and the National Army serving the president, targeting aid groups and committing human rights abuses. The population is reaching critical levels of malnutrition and a lack of access to basic resources such as water. In fact, more than 7 million people, that is nearly 2/3 of the population, currently need humanitarian aid. But the problem is that they are simply not receiving it. As much as international organizations try and promise aid and set up bases and ship in resources, the fact of the matter is that they cannot continue to promise effective rapid response and control when they can and then not deliver due to their own poor management. An estimated $1 billion, as I've stated before, were invested into this peacekeeping mission just last year, and yet they are yet to yield successes. If there's one thing UNMISS teaches us, it is that we cannot rely on international organizations to control natural resources, and we cannot even rely on them to save the people who would potentially be using them. The people of South Sudan do not see the effects of the $1 billion that were supposedly invested into their own health, and as such, international organizations should not control natural resources because they cannot control natural resources. The negative further argues that rather than international organizations controlling scarce natural resources, we must prioritize global education about and alternatives to these scarce and finite resources. While my partner Laura will build on this later, here's some background. Roger Mark D'Souza, former Director of Population, Environmental Security, and Resilience at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., argues that educating future leaders is essential in ensuring adequate resource supplies as well as diversified economies and fail-safe resource use. As an example, for a local solution, as a local alternative, a farming community in Colorado has increasingly been using methane gas produced by the cows on their farms that is damaging to the environment. They've been collecting it and transforming it into biofuels that now run the community's dumpster trucks. This is an example of a sustainable use of resources that may have been waste otherwise, but have been put into good use in order to help transport other waste and prevent using actual environmentally damaging fuels. This is an example of a local alternative to something an international organization would require much more money and much more time to do. And as such, we believe that before turning to international organizations to make empty promises, we must focus on local solutions instead. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Is our opponent aware that our organization has various partners, such as Transparency International, to prevent bias?
We believe that we cannot trust these partners that the affirmative has stated.
Thank you. So the opposition is aware.
The opposition aware that this hypothetical organization would have partners, however, we do not see how this would help them.
Is the organization not aware that our organization is formed with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch instead of individual countries?
Well, actually, at the beginning of your speech, you did state that it would have voluntary joining of different countries. So we do believe that you did state that it would have countries involved.
Is the opposition aware that we have stated our organization's leaders are formed by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch?
Yes, we are aware, but again, we do not see how using existing.
Is the opposition aware that our organization is legally binding, unlike the United Nations?
We are aware, but again, we do not see how this
Thank
would
you.
in any way be effective.
Would the opposition agree that a fair economic system would be better than our current one? Yes or no?
The opposition is aware, but the opposition doesn't understand why so individual countries would allow this organization to impose on their sovereignty.
Would the opposition agree that a fair economic system would be better for the whole world?
Yes.
Thank you. Can the opposition give an example of other organizations that deal with resource distribution successfully?
Successfully, the opposition is not aware of any successful international organizations.
Thank you. Is the opposition aware that our organization would not need peacekeepers as we will trade resources and not occupy countries?
The opposition does not believe that it would be effective either way, so the opposition does not see how either situation would be an effective solution to these issues.
And thus the opposition is aware that our organization does not need peacekeepers.
Yes.
Thank you.
One sec. Guys, go.
Good morning, honorable judges, esteemed opponents, and our audience. My name is Do-won Kim from the Istanbul International Community School, and I'm joined by my partner, Leland Lee. Today we will be debating the moot. Scarce world resources should be controlled by an international organization. We, the affirmative team, believe that scarce natural resources should be organized by international organizations. To summarize my partner's points, she explained the importance of establishing a new international organization for the control of scarce world resources. She then outlined her vision of this new organization that would act as a broker agency in partnership with experienced humanitarian aid organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. We, the affirmative team, would like to emphasize that creating this organization would not violate the principle of national sovereignty because member states would join on a voluntary or needed basis. As a second speaker, I will explain how a lack of an international organization and a predetermined allocation system will inevitably prompt geopolitical conflicts in scarce world resources, as scarce world resources are not naturally distributed equally. These conflicts have the potential to cause multinational economic, socio-political, and humanitarian crises, which can be prevented by the implementation of the said international organization mentioned by my partner. Before we commence with stating our points, however, we would like to question some of the points brought up by our opponents. The negative speakers emphasized that there would be corruption in the leaders of the countries that are represented in this international organization. However, we would like to stress that the leaders of our organization are not political leaders of nations, and this was not implied in any way in my partner's speech. and thus no one will monopolize the power because we have repeatedly mentioned that our organization is international, not an organization that is corrupted by the Western domination or a domination of a specific country in the organization. They also mentioned that we did not describe the logistical information of our organization in detail. However, my partner spoke in depth about the cooperation and extraction and allocation of resources. She also mentioned that the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International will be working in partnership and leading the distribution missions. However, this was completely dismissed and undermined in the negative speech. Also, they mentioned that this first affirmative spoke about the conflict of Australia and Ethiopia over food. However, we would like to emphasize that this was not a conflict and was actually an amicable relationship between Australia and Ethiopia, and is an example that we will elaborate in my speech. They also mentioned that our organization will not have a specific agenda. Unlike the United Nations, which has a different agendas that, rather than just resource distribution, our organization will be focusing on just resource distribution, and this will be able to focus on this matter more than the United Nations that they spoke highly of. Also, we are completely aware of the corruption issues with the UN mission in South Sudan. However, our organization is completely unaffiliated with the United Nations. And just because there have been organizations such as the UN that have failed with resource distribution does not mean that we should just give up and not implement a new organization that has the potential to solve resource conflicts, such as in the DR Congo, which has killed 5.4 million deaths. We would also like to mention that the UN is not legally binding. However, our organization is legally binding, and thus it makes a difference between our organization and the United Nations. Now we would like to continue stating our points. To demonstrate the detrimental effects of geopolitical conflicts relating to resource distribution, we can examine the example of the ongoing resource war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with information from articles compiled from the BBC. Congolese land was notable for its abundance of natural resources, such as gold, diamonds, tin, ivory, and coltan, and were subjected to centuries of imperialism due to their wealth. The First and Second Congo War from 1996 to 2003 were first prompted by the Rwandan government's attempt to oust the ineffective Congolese president they had placed in power, who they believed to be an obstacle in maintaining their political and economic interests in Congo. Soon, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Namibia, Sudan, Chad, Libya, and Angola joined the two countries in a proxy war, but were accused of having ulterior motives to attain the natural resources in Congo. This was shown to be accurate as the Rwandan and Ugandan troops engaged in warfare in the city of Kisangani, which is an important site in the Congo lucrative diamond trade. As the war continued, the parties began to focus on gaining access to the extraction and sale of these resources. Although a peace treaty ended the war in 2003, militant rebel groups like the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda and the Ugandan Allied Democratic Forces continued to finance their terrorist activities by exploiting Congo's natural resources. Thus, the ongoing war that has caused 5.4 million deaths and massive political instability in Central Africa can be attributed to the appeal of rich natural resources and the lack of established regulations from an international agency. My partner proposed in her speech that this organization would regulate natural resource allocation on a regional level. This aspect would have been beneficial in preventing the multinational war in Central Africa, which disrupted the political atmosphere of almost 10 countries. In contrast with the example of the Congolese wars, the exchange of timber between Ethiopia and Australia in 1894 is a key historical example that supports the necessity of an international body for resource distribution. This information is compiled from a report published by the University of Botswana. In 1894, when the Emperor of Ethiopia ordered the capital to be moved to Addis Ababa, the country faced issues of massive deforestation around the city, which resulted in the lack of firewood and timber for industrial purposes. The emperor was given eucalyptus trees from Australia, which are known to be highly adaptive and fast-growing. Thus, through this exchange, Ethiopia was able to reforestate Addis Ababa and use the timber from the eucalyptus trees to build infrastructure for the new city. The action of gifting the renewable source of trees proved to be highly beneficial to Ethiopia, in which timber was considered a scarce resource. Therefore, the implementation of the international agency would further help interactions like these to flourish through its efficiency and multinational collaboration. Thus, We, the Affirmative team, firmly believe that the agency, working in collaboration with the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, will be instrumental in preventing and resolving prominent conflicts of resource distribution in a global scale. As my partner Langley has stated, intergovernmental bodies such as the EU have previously stated that the competition for natural resources is an international challenge. Thus, this broker organization that we mentioned to be in partnership with the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Transparency International to prevent corruption will be able to effectively address this issue and provide massive benefits to the international community. Thus, we are affirmative in our stance that scarce world resources should be controlled by an international organization. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. We have some questions. How would you justify your newly created international organization not imposing on national sovereignty when it is in fact legally binding?
It will not impose on national sovereignty because countries are joining on a voluntary or needed basis, thus they will be compromising their
However,
national
what if they
sovereignty.
choose to pull out of the agreement?
My partner repeatedly mentioned that this was legally binding, so they cannot pull out.
But as nations keep their own well-being in mind, what if the nation decides that the share they are being given is not equitable and they choose to pull out of the agreement, but the international organization has left them at a disadvantage?
It will not be a case of inequitable distribution because this is an international cooperation with
How can this be
multilateral.
ensured?
We mentioned repeatedly about the logistics of our
Well, you
organization.
have mentioned the leaders of your international organization will be unbiased because of certain organizations that will be working with it, but how can we ensure that those organizations are unbiased? How can we put the trust of, can all countries in the world put the trust of all of their resources in the hands of an international organization when we do not even know who is essentially regulating it?
Well, we would like to remind the opposition that in fact those countries are leading those, the countries, the organizations that are leading our organization are represented by leaders from other countries, but not political leaders.
But how do we know that they're not being influenced by political leaders? How can we trust all these hypotheticals to control something as crucial as natural resources?
You previously mentioned that Transparency
Again,
International.
going back to Transparency
Transparency International is not a resource distribution organization. It prevents corruption by
It
analyzing.
is still an organization run by human beings, and human beings are inherently biased, so how do you justify
We do not
that?
believe there is sufficient empirical evidence about how human nature is corrupted in that way.
Well, seeing as you didn't necessarily provide any empirical evidence in either of your speeches, how would you justify either of these? How would you justify this international organization being controlled?
I would like to mention that we used empirical evidence, in fact, a lot of empirical evidence in the second paragraph to explain the logistical information about our agency.
Time.
Sorry, these are the finals starting at 12.
Whenever the judges are ready.
Sorry, one sec.
Honorable judges, worthy opponents, and fellow guests. Today, my partner Malak and I will be opposing the motion of scarce natural resources should be controlled by an international organization. While our opponents believe that an international organization should control scarce natural resources, we thoroughly support the idea that international organizations do not possess the necessary structure to distribute scarce resources. Our opponents have said that the UNEP was a success, but have failed to acknowledge their failures to protect the people of Darfur, Sudan. What about when locals were being killed because of their want and need to access water? What about the children and the families who just want basic human needs? What about when their wells were broken? What about when their wells were poisoned? The UNEP has implemented the ECP, a program that took place between 2008 and 2015, and this has failed, and our opponents have failed to mention this as an example. The conflict still persists. Our opponents have not given examples of the successes, but as negative, we will happily provide the inabilities, which is something that I will also build up on my speech. Furthermore, our opponents have said that their idealistic international organization would have non-biased leaders. But how can we trust these organizations when they are run by favoritism? How can we make sure that bias is avoided? We can't. As my partner has stated, it's human nature. We always have our own interests in our minds. And as for the leaders and the delegates who run these organizations, they have their own national interests in mind as well. Because at the core, they're there to protect their country, and they're there to make sure that their people are satisfied. Furthermore, we would like to remind that international organizations likely take sanctions from the United Nations and follow the structure of the United Nations. Therefore, the United Nations is an example that we need to heavily focus on, because it is such a powerful organization which at the core is corrupt. There's 3,900 children worldwide that are suffering from malnutrition every single day that die. And 1.1 billion people don't have access to potable water. And these numbers aren't getting better. And our opponents have failed to mention any statistics that can prove to us that these numbers are getting better. Therefore, we believe that these situations are just simply getting worse and worse. We as negative would like to further state that our opponents use many hypotheticals and also disregard the mistakes of international organizations. Now moving on to my arguments. Our first reason as to why we disagree with the motion is because international organizations have been prone to corruption, especially at the heart of the United Nations, an organization created to secure international cooperation. Yet the reality of this intergovernmental organization is covered up with a layer of lies. The League of Nations was formed in 1919, created to help maintain a power balance between small nations and larger nations. Yet, as time progressed, this aim was tested. It was undermined, because it is evident that larger nations had the upper hand in international crises in which the League of Nations was called upon. The Manchurian crisis of 1931 and the Abyssinian crisis of 1936 are clear examples as to how the League of Nations was unable to help smaller nations who were in need of help, where the larger nations with more power came out on top. Members of the Council included Italy, France, Japan, and Britain, who prioritized their national interests. We would think that this would be a flaw of the imperialistic and war-ridden 28th century. However, this flaw is also prevalent in the structure of the United Nations today. The United Nations have been unable to prevent major crises in many low-income countries, which helps me construct this first point further, as this is a continuation of how these organizations favor more powerful countries. The 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States, have veto power, the ability to vote against a resolution, resulting in instant rejection to the said resolution. Some officials have admitted that certain UN reports are edited by P5 members before it is presented to the Security Council, giving these permanent members an unfair advantage over the other non-permanent members. Simply, this becomes a further show of favoritism within these international intergovernmental organizations, where they're meant to have a neutral opinion and they're supposed to support countries regardless of their economic, political, and societal challenges. This abuse of power is further pushed as certain topics are taboo within the Security Council. As an example, Chechnya and the South Chinese Sea. It has been disclosed that it is understood that certain P5 nations have disclosed that it is unacceptable, and they have forbidden to talk about these certain topics within Security Council. Therefore, if these topics are forbidden from discussion, then delegates cannot be held accountable of their claims. Yet how does this mean, what does this mean for the control of scarce natural resources by international organizations? Well, the question arises, if the United Nations is corrupt and cannot maintain an equal level of contribution in its most powerful committee, then how can natural resources be managed efficiently? The fear is it can't. Corruption, regardless of which committee it happens in, is corruption. The system of veto power and equality of power persisted for almost an entire century. An entire century filled with the promise that smaller nations are equal to their larger counterparts. But is this really what we're seeing through the United Nations? Is United States of America really as equal as South Sudan? In fact, what have their contributions really been to these nations? What we might also want to consider is the alternative ways of managing scarce resources without involving the incompetence of the United Nations. Perhaps what we need to think about is how we can alter the mindsets of leading politicians. In 2017, Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement, a proposal that diminished the use of coal and other damaging resources to our environment in hopes of decreasing the negative impact on our atmosphere. Now, here's a fact that many people know. Donald Trump doesn't believe in climate change. And because of this, has progressed the use of coal in industries across the United States of America after Obama's many appeals and laws to ban it. It is as though America is taking 10 steps back because not only are we damaging the world in which we live in, but we're also using our finite resources that will eventually run out. Creating and maintaining this dependency on scarce resources simply means that in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years, we'll be out of these resources and we will not have any other way to replace them. This brings me to my primary example of Ghana, where sewage, which would otherwise be dumped into the ocean, leading to water pollution, is now being dumped into facilities. This sewage water is filtered, burned, and crushed into powder to create an alternative for coal, which is used in nearby communities, and which also aids the country's battle with deforestation. These alternative methods of controlling scarce resources are much more effective than the United Nations could ever be. My partner and I do understand that the United Nations does not define every single international organization, but we do agree that a lot of international organizations do take the United Nations as an example, and if this example is corrupt and favors favoritism, then what's the point? Therefore, we continue to oppose this motion. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your speech. Is the opposition aware that the affirmative never said that the UNEP was a successful organization, and we simply quoted their view that resource scarcity is one of the greatest security risks of the 21st century?
Yet then the negative is confused as to why they would mention the UNEP in
you.
their argument if it was not successful.
You mentioned are you assuming that humans always have some kind of self-gratifying nature that will cause there to be corruption in our organization?
No, we're not assuming, we know.
Thank you. Are you undermining the countless benevolent volunteer organizations that have implemented good for numerous people in the world?
We believe that these successes do not confiscate for the failures.
Thank you. So are you providing a paradoxical argument that although humans have a self-gratifying nature, they do benevolent activities? Thank you. You also mentioned the League of Nations and the United Nations. However, wouldn't you agree that the P5 system in the Security Council and the veto system are specific to the UN and not representative of our new organization?
Yes, but as we've mentioned, a lot of these other organizations that could potentially be created or that exist, they take the United Nations as an example. So
Thank you. Is the opposition aware that we do not give the United Nations as an example in any point in our speech?
yes, but this doesn't matter because
Thank
it's
you.
our argument.
How is Donald Trump's decision in the Paris Climate Agreement relevant to our mood in which we are discussing an international organization and not solely the United
It
Nations?
shows that at the core of everything lies the mindsets of politicians that need to be altered to make sure that they understand the vitality of these issues that inflict our world.
Thank you, but aren't you aware that we mentioned frequently in our speech that political leaders of countries such as Donald Trump will not be leading these organizations?
Yes, of course, but these other people that represent the United States of America will of course be inflicted with these.
How can the
opinions of their
opposition
governments.
ensure that these people will work in correspondence with people such as Donald Trump?
Yeah, but then why they wouldn't work in correspondence, but they still support the government? They're still representing that government.
Is there empirical evidence for this?
Well, as you stated in your speech, these delegates would.
Thank you.
judges, esteemed guests, and most worthy opponents. To close this fruitful debate, I would like to make some final rebuttals on behalf of the negative and finally restate our own points. The affirmative was continuously dealing with a perfect hypothetical international organization throughout their argument. They laid out some logistics and explained some potential examples where it could have been useful in the past. However, they failed to actually provide any examples of any existing successful international organizations. They stated organizations that would contribute to theirs. But again, what is an international organization that controls scarce world resources off of which theirs would be modeled, or off of which theirs could draw inspiration, or perhaps which actually works? Why should we support this motion when they have not actually provided any examples of how it already does? And if we cannot trust existing international organizations to control scarce natural resources who claim to protect and equitably distribute them, how can we trust our opponent's proposed idealistic international organization? When it is inevitable, they've claimed that it will have no relation to the United Nations. However, it is inevitable that any new, small, newly forming international organization will likely draw inspiration or likely build their modeling of organization off of at least some branch of the United Nations. It is the largest international organization in the world. It is a very important factor to consider as it spans all topics and all issues. Again, they claim it will be dealing with resource trading and be voluntary. However, who's to say that countries such as China, with conflicts such as that in the South Chinese Sea, will want to subject themselves to further external intervention by a new international organization? If they do not want the United Nations, a supposedly trusted and very far-reaching and powerful international organization, to deal with the issue in the South Chinese Sea, who's to say that they would allow this newly formed international organization to go in there and try and solve these disputes? Furthermore, the time taken and funds required for this international organization to be formed should instead be dedicated to national programs and alternatives, as both my partner and I have argued in the past with many examples. So now to move back into our own arguments that we presented, we argued that international organizations, such as the United Nations, are prone to corruption. For example, the United Nations at its very core with the Security Council is prone to corruption, with its P5 nations having much more power, with the larger nations having much more power than the smaller nations. And as such, this existing international organization has not been proven to be successful, so why should new ones be? Furthermore, international organizations are inefficient in areas of conflict, such as the United Nations mission in South Sudan, and globally 3,900 children are still dying every single day of malnutrition and a lack of water. And as such, we cannot turn a blind eye and allow more time and more idealistic international organizations to take action. We should take national action now and instead provide alternatives. As my partner argued, the political mindset of people must be changed, such as Trump and the Paris Agreement. We have misplaced trust in international organizations. And as such, we continue to negate the argument that international organizations should be controlled that natural resources should be controlled by international organizations.
Honorable judges, esteemed opponents, and our audience, we, the affirmative team, are pleased to conclude our debate today, showing how an international organization should absolutely control the world's scarce natural resources. However, before we summarize our points, we would first like to counter some of the points brought up by our opposition. We believe that they may have misunderstood the agenda of our organization. We have repeatedly stated that our organization would compose of leaders from Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch, not political leaders from individual countries at all. Our organization simply provides a fair, benevolent place for the exchange of resources between countries in need. Thus, their arguments on the United Nations are irrelevant, ungrounded, and they falsely assume bias in our organization, which is actually non-existent. In fact, we partnered with Transparency International as a precautionary measure to effectively eliminate any possible bias and corruption in our organization. The opposition fails to see how our organization is fundamentally different from the United Nations and is actually built on a much better ground with Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, organizations without bias or corruption scandals, as well as Transparency International to hold our organization accountable and fair. We would like to stress that our organization facilitates fair trade between countries, and that these countries would have a hand in negotiating the exchange alongside with our organization, which is why it is a better economic system than the current one today. We agree with our opposition that many people are currently suffering from a lack of essential resources, which is exactly why our international organization is needed. The opposition repeatedly stated that there are no organizations, in present or past, that has the same function and effectiveness of ours. Thus, we should build this benevolent organization with great potential for our future. By giving individual countries the alternative method of exchange of scarce natural resources so that conflicts such as the United States and China trade war, the conflict in the Langcourt rocks, as well as the resource curse, our organization fully solves these problems which the opposition failed to counter. Thus, through my partner and I's examples of how our organization is fully respectful of national sovereignty, is a better alternative economic model that fosters the benevolent and equal exchange of goods, of scarce natural resources across the globe, we absolutely believe that our international organization should control the world's scarce natural resources, as we would thus build a better future for the entire world. Thank you.
Wait, whoa, you got another round of rebuttals.
Yeah, each
Yeah.
one does. Yeah.
You got a second negative and a second affirmative rebuttal in a second.
2 minutes and 50
I
seconds.
love it, nice second. I love it, so I need
Sorry, I guess you guys need that part. Okay.
Honorable judges, worthy opponents, and fellow guests, in order to bring this debate to a closure, we would like to point out some of the mistakes of our opposition. They have mentioned, they have not provided us with any examples of organizations that have worked in the past or in the present. Therefore, we can't trust that their organizations will too not fail. Because although stated before, the bias and even though these leaders that our opposition talks about from Amnesty International will not be delegates of certain nations, they will still have their own opinions. Everyone has their own opinions, and these opinions always, in some way or another, support a country's nationalistic ideals. And at the core of everything is really what these countries want for their people, and therefore it's not fair to exclude this argument. Our opponents have, decided to disregard the United Nations completely. However, as my partner has already stated, and as I have stated in my speech, we don't think that the United Nations is the only international organization in the world. However, we do believe that because of this huge international scope that it has, that is able to reach all areas of conflict in all nations worldwide. Therefore, we think that it's not fair to disclude the United Nations from our argument, as the United Nations has been corrupt so much that it has done nothing. And to continue, we would like to restate some of the points that we discussed. Firstly, my partner has discussed the inability of the United Nations to help with in Sudan. And to build on this, I have mentioned the inability of the United Nations as a whole and of the League of Nations through their veto power system, and how just the power of 5 strong nations can undermine the power of smaller ones. We have also talked about perhaps changing the political mindset of leading politicians, because essentially this is what is at the core of the diplomatic problems that are caused worldwide. These diplomats are not able to agree with each other on issues that should be agreed upon, that scarce natural resources are running out, that in 10 years and 20 years and 50 years will be out and there will be no other way to fix them. And therefore, we would like to further oppose the motion that scarce natural resources should be controlled by an international organization. Thank you.
Seconds.
Thank you for this wonderful debate. The affirmative team would like to reaffirm their points and also rebut some of the points that were mentioned by our opposition. First of all, our opposition made the mistake of affiliating our new international organization with the United Nations repeatedly. Although we had corrected them through the rebuttals, it was repeated in the second speaker's speech. However, the P5 system, the veto system, and the incompetence of the United Nations given through the examples of the South Sudan war that was mentioned in the speaker's speech is completely irrelevant to our argument, because we did not mention that our new organization would be led or affiliated with the United Nations at all. Also, they mentioned that the United Nations is an example of an international organization that has failed. However, we must understand that the United Nations have different agendas to deal with, unlike our international organization, which has a singular focus. For example, the United Nations established the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals to reach until 2030. Issues such as gender equality, human rights, child labor, things like these are also part of the agenda of the United Nations. However, our organization do not deal with issues such as these because we are singular and we are focusing on the issue of resource distribution. Also, our opposition has assumed the human's self-gratifying nature in terms of corruption, and the fact that if our organization was established, that leaders would want to exploit and embezzle goods for their own benefits. However, this is just an assumption, and the opposition has not provided empirical evidence on how this would actually occur, and it's just a hypothetical situation. And our opposition have criticized our argument that it is hypothetical, but however, we would like to emphasize that because we are proposing a new international organization that does not exist yet, it is implicit that it is hypothetical because we have no other choice. Also, we would like to restate our points. My partner Ling spoke about the fact that this organization does not violate national sovereignty because countries are joining on a voluntary or needed basis. And I also emphasize that we are completely in need of this international organization because of the conflicts such as with the Democratic Republic of Congo that are still existing. We also mentioned that the pre-existing interactions between countries, such as the one between Ethiopia and Australia and Timberwood, would flourish with the establishment of the international organization because this international organization would help in facilitating more of these relationships. So therefore, we would like to conclude this debate by reaffirming that our team is affirmative in our stance that scarce world resources should be controlled by an international organization.